The river came down from the hills like a silver thread, quiet and patient, touching every field in Gold Bar before it slid under the wooden bridge and curved past the mill. People taught their children to respect it, to rinse their hands at its edge before meals, to keep buckets full because a dry day could turn a home into a small, airless grave. On most mornings it looked like a piece of sky laid on the ground, and the town moved with a trust that felt almost like prayer. But trust bends in late March when the days grow bright and the wind turns thin. Then the river begins to hold its breath and everyone else holds theirs. They call it the waiting week and no one says why. The year is 1879 and Gold Bar is smaller than the maps make it seem. A handful of streets, a clapboard church, a school with a bell that sticks on damp days, and a mill wheel that turns with the slow ache of an old joint. The orchards lean toward the water like thirsty animals. Girls fill pitchers with eyes lowered, boys dare each other to stand on the rail of the bridge, and mothers watch with hands pressed flat against aprons, telling the boys in low voices to step back because the boards are old. No one says the other reason. They do not speak of the way the river sometimes reddens, not bright, not quick, but a deep rusty stain that starts at the edges and takes on the current like a thought a person cannot push away. It has happened before, always near the equinox, and the town has learned to pretend the color comes from far hills or iron soil or anything that is not alive. Pretending is easier when you have chores. Henry Alderman counts on that. He lives in a white house by the sluice with a neat yard and a fence the color of pale bone. He is the water commissioner, a quiet man with long fingers who fixes pumps before they fail and posts ration notices in steady hand, and the town calls him careful, which is a kind word when people do not look too closely. He keeps ledgers, one for supply and one for usage, with numbers that add cleanly and notes that sound like mercy. He writes that the widows get extra pails in dry spells and that the mill must slow when the current weakens. He smiles when he speaks about balance, and people feel safe when they hear the word. Balance sounds like fairness, it sounds like care. Mary Harrow, who wears grief in the fold of her sleeve since her husband slipped from the bridge 2 springs ago, tries not to hate that word. She watches the river from her window and it watches her back, flat and blank as a sheet of tin. She has learned the way the light on its surface shifts when the current hesitates and when it races. Some days she believes the river remembers. Other days she decides memory is only a trick the living play on themselves. In the waiting week, the town grows restless in small ways that do not look like fear until you add them together. Men mend buckets that are still sound. Children whisper as if a sleeping thing might wake if voices rise. The church ladies put extra salt in the broth. Dogs refuse the shallows and drink from barrels instead. Henry walks the bank at dawn with a notebook he does not open, marking the pull of the current with his pulse, measuring the bend with the length of his stride, listening for the tiny hitch in the flow that says enough. He has rules he never wrote down but obeys like a sermon. If the river drags, the town has asked too much. If it hurries, the town is in danger of breaking. He believes the river has a weight, not only of water but of breath and bread and days, and that weight must match the lives it carries. He tells himself that order is kindness and that drift is the real cruelty. He tells himself that the worst harm comes from those who look away when the measure is wrong. The river has a memory, he thinks, but it does not forgive. No one hears these thoughts because Henry keeps his face polite and his trousers pressed and his lawn trimmed in clean lines. He is the kind of man people nod to and forget because forgetting is easy when someone looks like part of the furniture of a place. Mary does not forget. She remembers the slick sound the water made when it swallowed her husband, the way the color darkened at the edges before anyone would say the word. She remembers Henry at her door with kind eyes and a note for extra pails, the ink still wet, as if mercy and loss lived on the same page. She remembers that when she asked why the river turned, Henry said the earth shifts and sometimes it bleeds. And she heard the way he loved the word, shifts. The waiting week ends on a morning that begins with gulls, though Gold Bar lies far from the coast. They wheel over the fields and cry like hungry babies, and their shadows slice over the water in thin, dark shapes. Henry stands at the bank and dips his hand, and the cold feels wrong, not sharp like snowmelt, but flat and heavy, a chill that presses into the skin and stays. He wipes his palm on his sleeve and feels a calm that does not come from comfort. Calm is a tool. He breathes carefully and watches a leaf spin in place where the current should carry it away. Mary carries a pail to the pump and feels the handle bite her fingers. She looks up at the hills and thinks the color of the sky looks thin, as if something has been taken from it to feed the river. At noon the mill wheel slows and the groan carries across town like a warning no one wants to name. People stop tasks mid-motion, then force their hands to move again. Children are kept inside. By evening the surface shines flat as hammered metal, and the first faint bands of brown appear in the reeds, not a stain yet, only the hint of one. A neighbor says aloud that iron does that in spring and then lowers his eyes as if the sentence itself were rude. Mary puts her pail on the floor and does not drink. She opens her palm and finds a smear of grit that looks darker than dirt. She thinks of weight and of measure, of a scale that leans and a hand that makes it right. She does not know yet that a ledger page has torn free and will soon drift up against a root near the bend, its numbers neat, its margins clean, its red marks careful as stitches. She only knows that the town is breathing too quietly, as if quiet might change what is already moving toward them. Night comes without stars. The river keeps its face plain, but its body is turning. Somewhere Henry stands in the dark and counts not seconds but ounces, as if time itself could be weighed, and he thinks about balance until balance feels like love. In the morning a fisherman will find something that looks like a sign. For now the story waits at the edge of the water where numbers and mercy share the same ink, and the calculation is almost ready to begin. Slowly, Henry Alderman's home was as ordered as his ledgers. The white clapboard walls met at precise corners, the shutters painted in a shade that neither stood out nor faded too much. Even the small patch of earth behind his house was divided into equal beds, each row of vegetables rising at the same height, each stalk spaced as if planted by a ruler. Neighbors praised his neatness, never noticing how unnatural it looked for soil to be so controlled. Inside, the front room smelled faintly of ink and boiled starch. The desk by the window bore no dust, the quills laid in perfect parallel, the ink bottles aligned by height. It was here that Henry kept the town's water ledgers, bound in dark, oiled leather that had softened under his hands over decades. The official ledger lay always in plain sight, ready to be seen by any visiting councilman or curious neighbor. Its pages carried the steady flow of names, dates, and water allotments, every entry a clean reflection of civic order. But the other ledger, the one kept under the false bottom of the desk drawer, was different. This one was written in the same careful hand, but in a code that looked harmless unless you knew the key. The columns were not gallons, but weights, not dates, but cycles, not notes, but reasons, each one compressed into a word that could not be understood without Henry's private lexicon. The code had begun when Henry was barely a man. His first job as assistant water commissioner had taught him that supply was only half the work. The harder half was deciding who deserved it. In his early years, he learned that water scarcity was like a sickness. If you let it spread, it touched everyone, and if you cut it off sharply, you could save the rest. The town called such choices unfortunate necessities. Henry learned to think of them as pruning, removing what strained the root. By the time he was appointed commissioner, the code was a language only he could read, one that could hold the entire moral weight of a life in a few strokes of the pen. Each name was paired with a number for their worth and a figure for their burden. Worth could rise with service or thrift. Burden could swell with waste or disobedience. When burden outweighed worth, Henry marked a thin red line beside the name and moved them into the next cycle's final column. No one ever asked why his ration adjustments came with such precision. No one connected the drops in certain families' water supply to sudden accidents on the river. Henry had learned early that the truth is safest when it hides in plain arithmetic. The river did not care for human excuses, he told himself. It cared for balance, and he was its appointed hand. Every equinox the balance was reviewed. Sometimes the list was short, sometimes long. The red lines were never arbitrary. To Henry they were acts of stewardship. In public, Henry spoke little but always with the tone of a man who considered every word before offering it. People trusted that tone. They saw a man who kept the town alive through droughts and dry winds, who never lost a drop to carelessness. They liked the way his records could be checked against years past and found without flaw. They liked that he was predictable. Predictable meant safe. What they could not see was the way predictability in Henry's mind meant the same pattern year after year, the same invisible ritual at the riverbank, the same careful subtraction of lives. That spring, the ledger under the desk was already filling with red lines weeks before the equinox. The winter had been mild, the snow melt thin, and Henry felt the weight shift too soon. He noted extra rations to the mill during a dry week, compensating by marking down the names of those he judged less necessary. He found no cruelty in the choice. Cruelty to him was letting the river be weakened by too many mouths and too little respect. Each mark brought him the same quiet satisfaction as aligning the shutters on his home. At night, Henry would take the hidden ledger from its drawer and rest it on the desk as if it were a devotional book. He would read the names in the red column slowly, tasting them in silence, remembering their faces without sentiment. He thought of them not as victims, but as adjustments. Some had wasted water on laundry in the dry weeks. Others had spoken against his ration orders. A few simply carried a burden too great for their worth to balance. The page held them all without judgment, only calculation. As the days inched toward the equinox, Henry's walks along the river became longer. He would trace his fingers along the sluice gate and listen to the low, constant murmur of water forced through narrow space. In the sound, he could hear whether the town was in balance. This year, the tone was off. A sluggish undercurrent beneath the surface, a warning only he seemed to hear. He imagined the red seeping into the current, not as blood, but as the earth reclaiming what was owed. Henry Alderman, to anyone looking in from the street, was the image of civic reliability. To himself, he was something quieter and far more necessary, the keeper of balance. The ledger was not just his work. It was the map of a world kept orderly through discipline, a world that required small, precise acts to hold back chaos. In that order, Henry saw beauty. In that beauty, he saw his purpose. And as the river's breath slowed, he knew the time for the next set of adjustments was drawing near. By the time the equinox arrived, the red lines in the ledger would not just be marked on a page. They would be weights in his hands, ready to tip the balance back to where it belonged. Henry Alderman's understanding of balance began in a winter that nearly erased his family from the earth. He had been 8 years old in 1844, the year the frost came early and the snow lay heavy on Gold Bar's roofs before the last apples were picked. His father, Amos Alderman, was the water commissioner then, a man with hard eyes and a voice that could flatten a room without rising in volume. Amos believed the town's survival came down to discipline. And discipline meant knowing what to take away as well as what to give. That winter, the river slowed until it was more ice than current, and Amos told Henry they could not waste heat by breaking it. People would come for water, and some would leave empty-handed. Henry was told to watch and learn. Their house stood close enough to the sluice that Henry could hear the groan of ice shifting in the night. When the knock came at dawn, Amos opened the door just enough to see who stood there. Neighbors came with buckets, children with tin pails, old women holding jars wrapped in rags. Amos asked questions before filling any container. How much food do you have left? How many mouths are in the house? Have you wasted any water on washing? Henry noticed that the answers did not matter as much as the look in Amos's eyes when he weighed them. Some people were given a measure. Others were told there was nothing to spare. The ones turned away left slow, dragging their buckets like anchors. Henry learned not to ask why. The freeze worsened. By the third week, Amos brought Henry to the river at dusk. They carried 2 pails each, filled with water so cold it burned their fingers. Henry thought they were delivering it to someone in need. Instead, Amos led him to a spot where the current still moved under a veil of ice. There, Amos poured the water back in. Henry asked why, his voice trembling from the cold, and Amos told him the river's weight must remain steady, that too much taken without return would anger it. The river, he said, was like a scale. When it tipped too far, something would break, and when it broke, it would take more than they could give back. That was the winter Henry saw his first adjustment. It was not called that then. Amos never gave it a name. A man from the far edge of town had been taking more than his share for weeks, and one night he did not return from the river. Henry saw his body in the shallows the next morning, caught between two sheets of ice, his skin the color of wet clay. No one asked questions. No one accused. It was as if the man had simply been subtracted from the sum of the town. Amos told Henry that sometimes the scale must be reset, and that nature does not mind using human hands to do it. The lesson stayed with him. Over the years, Henry began to think in measures and balances without effort. A loaf of bread was not just food. It was a unit of energy that had to be weighed against the work done to earn it. A mouth to feed was not just a child or a wife. It was a measure that could grow or shrink depending on its discipline. People could add to the weight of the town or drain it, and it was the commissioner's job to keep that weight from tipping. By the time Amos died of a fever in the summer of '52, Henry had already begun keeping small ledgers of his own, marking who took more than they gave, who wasted in ways that might spread. He understood now that mercy could be a form of harm if it weakened the whole. His first year as commissioner was a dry one, and Henry made his first formal adjustments. A fisherman who left his nets soaking in the river for days, wasting water and scaring off the few fish that swam upstream. A widow who used her ration to bathe her dogs while neighbors' barrels ran dry. A pair of brothers who diverted a trickle from the mill race to wash gold pans. Each of them vanished in ways that caused no alarm. An overturned boat, a fever that came on in the night, a slip on the mossy stones. Henry recorded them in his private ledger, not as names but as weights and reasons as his father had taught. He did not see himself as cruel. Cruelty was letting imbalance grow until it crushed everyone. He thought of the river as a living thing, one that whispered in its slow current and its sudden floods, telling him when the measure was off. That voice had been in his head since the winter of '44, guiding his hand as firmly as Amos's ever had. He believed it was not simply his duty but his inheritance. The balance had passed from father to son, as sure as the ledgers and the keys to the sluice gate. By 1879, the weight of souls was not a metaphor to Henry. It was as tangible as the pails he carried, as real as the ink that seeped into his pages. Every life has a weight. Every weight had a place. And when the scale leaned, it was his hand that brought it back steady and sure as his father had shown him in the cold dark by the river so many years before. By the first week of March 1879, Henry Alderman's red column was complete. 13 names, each written with the same careful slope of the pen, each paired with a number in the burden column that outweighed its worth. He did not rush the work. The ledger had to rest once the list was made, as if the ink itself needed time to decide whether the marks were justified. Henry liked to think of it as letting the balance settle before touching the scale. When the final page dried, he closed the book and slid it into the hollow beneath the desk, the sound of the drawer clicking shut like a seal on a promise. His adjustments that year began with a fisherman named Thomas Brand, whose traps Henry had seen left to rot upriver, collecting silt and killing small fish the town relied on. Henry waited until the fog rolled thick over the water one dawn. He followed Thomas along the bank under the pretense of checking the sluice gates. At the bend near the mill's outflow, Henry stepped close enough to smell the stale tobacco on the man's coat. His hand moved with the precision of habit, fastening a narrow loop of wet rope around Thomas's ankle. The other end weighted with a river stone he had measured to match the man's build. One push was enough. The water claimed him without sound. The rope sank the weight, the body following as if drawn home. Henry noted the adjustment later that night, red ink curling clean around the entry. Next came Ruth Layton, who had ignored the winter ration notices, scrubbing her porch with full buckets while her neighbors' children carried dust on their skin. Henry called at her house under the guise of inspecting the pump, a leather satchel in hand. Inside were 2 iron pans, their centers drilled and threaded with wire. He asked her to hold one while he checked the balance, placing the second in her other hand. She laughed at the oddity, a brittle, uncertain sound, until he fastened them together around her wrists and stepped back. The pans were not heavy, but they were balanced to perfection. When he led her to the bank and tipped her forward, they filled evenly with river water, pulling her down without tipping. She sank like an offering. The rest followed in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. He chose different spots along the river each time. The narrow pass by the old bridge, the deep pool under the bluff, the silent backwater where the reeds grew thick. Each site had its own weight and measure, its own place in the balance. Some victims slipped on wet stones after a firm hand found their shoulder. Others drifted under while collecting water, their buckets filling faster than they could lift until the current took them. Henry's tools were simple: rope, stone, balance pans, and the river's own patience. He never left marks on the body, never disturbed the surface more than a ripple. Every adjustment carried a quiet satisfaction, but not the satisfaction of cruelty. Henry felt no joy in the moment, only the sense of correction, of a crooked line straightened. When he returned home after each act, he would remove his coat, wash his hands in cold water, and sit at the desk to make the entry. The sound of the quill scratching across the page was his final seal, the part that mattered most. He kept the red ink separate from the black, in a small glass bottle he only opened on these nights. Its color was deeper than fresh blood, closer to rust, the shade of the river's turning. The town noticed the disappearances in the same way they always had, quietly, with averted eyes and muted talk. A man missing from his stool at the tavern. A woman's washing was left unclaimed on the line. A child asking after a neighbor who no longer waved from her porch. The explanations were ordinary. People moved away, people drowned, people died in their sleep. No one pressed further. The equinox was close, and everyone knew the river would take something when the day came. Most preferred to think it was the river itself, a force beyond human reach. That belief suited Henry well. This cycle, however, he felt a difference. The current carried a sluggish drag even after the adjustments began, as if the river resisted the balance he offered. He added 2 more names to the red column mid-cycle, something he had never done before. A young mill hand who had poured a bucket of rinse water directly into the sluice, wasteful and fouling. An elder who had refused to cut back her washing even after a warning. These were smaller burdens, but Henry justified them. If the scale still leaned after the planned adjustments, more weight had to be taken away. It was the same logic his father had taught. Once you start pruning, you do not stop until the branch is healthy. By the last night before the equinox, Henry had made 11 adjustments. The red marks beside their names were neatly crossed out, the ledger now a clean page of balance restored. He walked the riverbank under the thin light of the moon, his boots leaving no deep prints in the wet soil. The water was cold and silent, carrying its weight evenly between banks. Henry breathed in the night air, tasting the faint metallic tang that told him the turning was near. He felt no guilt, no doubt. The balance had been kept, and the river would show its gratitude by running clear after the red passed. At least that was what he believed. What he could not know was that one of his adjustments had not stayed beneath the water. In the shallows upriver, tangled in a root, a body lay just beneath the surface, weighted still, the pans holding their measure, waiting to be found. The river, for the first time in Henry's memory, had not accepted all that was given to it. Mary Harrow woke to the sound of gulls and a hush that felt heavier than silence. And before the kettle finished steaming, she was at the river bend where the reeds fell like a thin curtain. The water looked tired, the surface dull, the color at the edges turning old brown like dried leaves. She had come to watch, not to hope, but a sliver of white snagged on a root made her slide down the mud. It was a page, thick and oiled, the kind made to survive damp rooms and rough hands. The edges were clean, the ink unwashed, the handwriting steady like rails laid across a field. Along the top ran neat columns in small letters that meant more than they first showed. Mary held it with both hands and felt the same sick pull she had felt the night her husband disappeared under the bridge. Wind tugged her skirt. The page did not tremble. She tucked it inside her shawl and climbed back up, her shoes filled with cold mud and her pulse beating like a hammer that would not stop. At the road she met two men carrying a tarp on poles, and beneath the sag of canvas lay the shape of a human chest and the slope of a shoulder. They kept their eyes on the ground as if respect could be measured by looking away. The smell of river iron moved with them. Mary stepped aside and did not speak because grief had become a private room she had learned to walk inside without noise. Behind them, Henry Alderman came along the bank with an empty notebook he did not open. He paused near the reeds and listened to the current as if it could answer a question only he could hear. His coat was dry, his cuffs pale, his mouth a patient line. Mary watched him until he moved on, then turned toward home with the page burning against her skin like a small, steady coal. In her kitchen, she shut the shutters and set the page on the table beside a chipped plate and a cork with a needle stuck in it. The columns were marked with single letters, NCRB. Names, cycles, reasons, burden. She traced each row with the needle point and felt the logic gather. Under N she saw Thomas Brand and Ruth Layton written plain, and after each name a number that rose and fell across weeks like a patient's pulse. Under R were words pared down to their bones: waste, trespass, dissent, repeat. The last column held space for a red stroke Mary could see even though the ink was brown in the lamplight. Beside some names, the thin line had been drawn with a care that looked almost tender. At the bottom of the page, a dividing line had been ruled, and below it the numbers stopped and a single sentence appeared in the same calm hand. Balance must be kept at the start. Mary knew numbers not in the trained way of clerks, but in the way of a widow who had learned to count each coin twice. She did not fear the code. She copied the letters into her head and began to test them against her memory of the town. The first red stroke fell the week her husband slipped, the burden number heavy as a stone. The reason beside his name was one word that made her jaw clench: dissent. She heard again how he had spoken against ration orders in a room that smelled of rope and sweat. He had said the river belonged to all, and she had pressed his hand under the table and asked him with her eyes to stop. Now the page told her how that sentence had been weighed. Her grief did not lift. It changed shape, gaining edges. She folded the page once and laid it under a loose floorboard, then took a scrap of paper and made a copy line by line in the same tight script, because secrets rot when they are moved and survive when they are doubled. At dusk, she returned to the bend and watched Henry align two stones with his heel until they balanced point to point. A quiet tower that meant nothing to others and everything to him. The river held its breath while he counted with still fingers. Mary wrapped her shawl and decided the plan on the page would not stay in ink for long. When the equinox wind rose, she would follow him from a distance and learn how the balance was made step by step until the river itself spoke. At dusk, she returned to the bend and watched Henry tip two stones together until they balanced, his fingers counting an invisible sum. The river seemed to wait with him. Mary drew her shawl tight and understood the page was a plan, not a record. When the equinox wind rose, she would follow him and watch the making of balance step by step. Henry Alderman prepared for the equinox with quiet hands, laying out his tools in the same strict order as always. 2 iron pans sat on the table, rims filed smooth, wires through their centers, loops tightened until they held shape. He sorted river stones by weight and feel, chalking faint numbers only he understood, then wiped the dust away. A short oak beam waited across 2 bricks, a balance he had carved with notches matching the pull of common bodies. Coarse rope lay cut to exact spans, each length knotted at measured points for judging distance by touch. He opened the hidden ledger, traced the red column with a finger, and closed it again without reading names because the list was already inside him. The ritual began with calibration, as it always did, because the river respected order when order showed respect first. He hung both pans, set a stone in the right, and spooned water into the left until the wood settled level. He whispered the count of spoonfuls, not like a prayer, but like a measurement anchoring him to fact when feeling tried to color the work. When balance held for 3 trials in a row, he untied his sleeves above the wrist, slid a small nail under his tongue, and stood still to listen. He left the house by the back, taking the path behind the mill, boots finding the same roots and ruts he always trusted in the dark. At the bend, he set the beam between 2 old roots like a simple gate, hung the pans and watched them hang quiet while the water murmured below. He filled 1 pan to the mark, left the other empty, felt the beam tip toward the river, then returned to center. Tonight the beam took longer to settle, a delay that put a small cold thought in his ribs. He chose a rounded stone, seated it, and imagined a wrist there, skin where iron would soon rest. Victims were not people here. They were measures that had to be placed where the system could carry them without noise or waste or cruel display. He preferred consent shaped by habit, a soft hand at an elbow, a steady offer to guide a bucket, a quiet word about the slickness of a plank. When the loop settled over bone, he coaxed a step forward and the river did the rest, adding its pull like a partner in careful work. He kept bodies whole, made no cuts, left only weight and water to finish the task because the river disliked fuss and he disliked mess. He believed this protected the town, believed it because the mill wheel turned easier after a cycle, because coughs edged away, because rations lasted. He believed it because failure looked worse in memory. The winter when balance broke and the river took 3 children in one dark rush. So he made adjustments year by year. Small, exact, not cruel in his mind, only necessary, like trimming a branch before it cracked and fell. This year something argued under the surface, not in voice, but in the way the water dragged and the pans turned when no wind moved the leaves. He told himself it was nothing, that the earth shifts, that roots grow, that a night can be strange without meaning, and then he worked anyway. On the 3rd night, he guided a man to the narrow pass, set the loop, and felt the body sink too slow, as if the river had grown thick and undecided. He waited until the current hid the shape, then reset the beam and checked his knots, hands steady, jaw tight, calm, forced back into place. Morning brought boys to the bend with a line and hook, seeking perch, not trouble, but trouble came anyway when metal caught metal beneath the reeds. They pulled together, laughing at the weight, thinking of old tools, until the pan rose, wire glinting, stone nested, a pattern made visible at last. Below it a shape turned, rocked once, and settled, still tethered by the careful rope that had never failed him before this cold, stubborn day. One boy swallowed a sound, the other shouted for men with poles and a tarp. Neighbors came with faces tight and mouths small, pretending order while their hands shook, and the whisper that followed ran faster than feet. Henry stood where the alder shades the bank and held an empty satchel like a clerk, measuring the time between first shout and first real fear. He watched thought move through the group like a stain, saw the word accident try to cover what their eyes were learning, and saw it fail. He turned before anyone looked uphill, took the long way home, and knew a new stage had begun. He dried the pans until they were plain, set the stones back in their boxes, and opened the ledger to draw a thin rule under the last red mark. But rumor is a kind of water, and he felt it already, seeking level through every crack, curling under doors, gathering in corners where people whispered. He closed the ledger and stood very still, listening to the house breathe, and knew the river would not be the only force he had to manage now. Others would test him, and they would not be gentle. He would need new poise, quieter steps, sharper measures, because the surface had broken and trouble was rising. The town did not face its fear in the open square. It gathered it in back rooms where flour dust hung in the air and the lamps made soft rings on the tables. Those who ran Gold Bar called themselves elders because it sounded like caretaking. But their real work was to keep the place running with the least noise. They had watched Henry for years and told themselves they were watching over him. They knew the river turned red every equinox, and they knew the turning always passed, and they let that knowledge become an excuse. Long ago, the first time a body washed ashore with wrists marked by iron, they did not name it. They told each other the river makes its own choices, and if a man helped the river keep balance, then perhaps that was nature wearing a human face. They never wrote this pact, but they lived it. Do not ask, do not look, accept the red as the cost of clear water afterward. Most years the cost stayed hidden. and the town kept moving like a machine with a quiet gear that only a few knew was there. This year the gear ground was loud enough for all to hear. When the boys pulled the iron pan from the reeds and the town carried the weighted shape home beneath a tarp, the elders felt the old pact tilt under their feet. They met that night in the back of the mill, door locked, wheel creaking outside like a tired animal. They spoke slowly as if speed might spill something. The youngest elder said the town could not carry a public story about balance. It needed an accident, a flood, a stranger to blame. The oldest said there had always been strangers, but the river had never reddened this early, and never kept the stain this long. The miller rubbed his thumb over a split in the table until a curl of wood lifted like a hangnail. And he said the wheel was slipping and the flour clumped, and he could not feed the town if the water stayed heavy. The churchman said prayer asks for mercy, but order asks for discipline, and perhaps both had to live in the same house. None of them spoke the word murder. It stuck in their throats like dry bread. Instead, they talked about keep the school open, keep the rations steady, keep the faces calm. Keep Henry steady too, because panic could make a hand tremble and a trembling hand could drown the wrong person. They agreed to watch him more closely while admitting they had always watched him, and they promised to stand between him and the law should an outsider take too much interest. They did not think about the people already gone. The pact had taught them to think about the people who remained. Henry was not invited to the meeting because invitations were their way of showing belief, and belief now felt dangerous. But the elders were not prepared to cut him off. They needed him still. The river needed him if the turning grew worse. The red had come early and stayed like a stain that would not wash. Livestock refused the shallows. Children woke with nosebleeds after nights of sweet iron in the air. Women boiled water and watched a skin form on top that broke like old paint. The town competed with the smell of metal every morning and lost. The elders told each other it would pass if the balance were restored. That hope was the most dangerous part of the pact, because it made every silence feel like virtue. Mary Harrow listened from the narrow stair outside the mill room, her back pressed to rough boards, her eyes on a seam of light along the floor. She heard enough to know the truth she had felt since her fingers first touched the ledger page. The town had not failed to see. It had chosen not to look. Her anger did not flare hot. It settled cold and clear, the way river water feels when you stand in it too long. She decided the pact would not hold if the river kept pushing back. She also decided that if the elders would not turn the page, she would. She went home and copied the figures again until she could see them with her eyes closed. She watched the road from behind the curtain and counted who visited Henry's house and how long they stayed. Later, she saw the churchman leave his gate and walk the fence line as if measuring the town with his steps. She saw the miller stop at the bridge and spit into the water, then stand ashamed of the small waste. She understood then how deep Henry's language had cut. Even those who feared him now spoke in his numbers. Henry, alone at his desk, felt the same math without using those words. The ledger told him the weight still leaned wrong. He had taken 11 names, and yet the current lagged, the turning thickened, the air pressed on the chest. He ran a finger down the list of burdens and stopped at a small one almost light enough to pass another cycle. A boy who carried water to the mill in a leaky pail, laughing as it dripped, wetting the dust into paste. The boy's mother had written to him once asking for an extra measure during a fever, and Henry had granted it because charity can strengthen worth if it teaches gratitude. The boy kept laughing with the leaky pail. It felt to Henry like a crack that would spread. He told himself the river notices small cracks more than it notices big speeches. He stood, set the red bottle on the desk, and let the glass touch wood without opening it, as if the contact itself were a decision. The pact would not hold. Henry Alderman opened the hidden ledger and felt the room draw tight because the line he was about to write would change the weight of the town. He wrote Eli Pike, 9, small burden, reason repeats cycle current, and held the pen above the paper as if a second thought might pull the word back. It did not. In Henry's mind, small cracks ruin walls, and this boy was a crack that laughed. Eli carried water to the mill in a pail that leaked down the road, making neat mud coins with every step. And he joked about feeding dust. Last winter, Henry had granted the family an extra measure during fever, expecting gratitude to turn into discipline. Instead, the boy's carelessness had become a habit. Henry told himself that habits teach other habits, and that small wastes teach big ones, and that a river notices such lessons faster than any person. He sharpened the red line beside Eli's name until it looked like patience given one last time. Across town, Mary Harrow watched the street from behind a curtain and saw Henry move with an intent that had lost its mask. She had copied the torn page twice and could read its code like blunt prayer. And she knew now that the smallest entry on a Henry page could grow into the loudest horror by night. She did not know which night. She decided to make herself the hinge between the boy and the river. Henry told himself he would not force anything ugly. He would only present the measure and let the river accept it. For a child, he needed a gentler apparatus, not because he doubted the logic, but because he feared noise. He built a narrow oak yoke with 2 shallow tins at its ends and a cup at the center to set true balance, a cradle that a small set of hands could carry without strain. When the tins met the current, water would rise on both sides at once, drawing the yoke down with steady quiet, the kind of descent that looked like sleep taking over a tired face. He tested it behind his house with stones that matched a child's weight, timed the pull and nodded when the wood settled flat under the surface. He told himself that order was kindness and that chaos was the true cruelty, and that one neat death could prevent a dozen foolish ones born of rot. He wrapped the yoke in cloth and walked the town like a clerk with a ledger under his arm. Eli watched him from the cooper's doorway with the pail hanging from 2 fingers. More dent than bucket, more toy than tool. Henry saw the dent the way a surveyor sees a crack in a dam. He asked Eli's mother, Martha Pike, about the pump in a voice that sounded like help. He promised to show the boy how to hold a measure so that strong men would nod. Martha smiled with the relief of a tired day and agreed before the shape of the offer had finished forming. The town noticed none of this because the town was busy surviving the red stain holding to the reeds like old paint. The elders met again and chose to wait, which was their language for closing their eyes without calling it that. Mary went to the Pike house with a loaf and a steady face and asked to sit while Martha folded linen at the yard line. She watched Eli trace his finger along the rim of the pail as if the leak were a pet. She told him quietly that some men call rules love and call harm balance, and that he should not walk at night with anyone who wanted to weigh his hands. The boy listened the way children do when fear is new. Eyes large, voice small, body undecided. Mary tied a thin strand of twine to his wrist and her own as a play, a simple string game that let her measure steps if the night turned strange. She told Martha the string was a charm to keep boys from wandering, and Martha laughed and let it be because charms cost nothing and sometimes help the heart breathe. At dusk, Henry turned the yoke again, filling one tin, then the other, counting slowly until the center cup steadied the wood like a held breath. He walked to the bend where reeds leaned inward and marked 2 heel prints in the mud with the edge of his boot. Half moon set a child's width apart. He stood there until he could imagine the exact angle of the boy's elbows, and the soft shock when the water first climbed the metal. The river made a sound that was not a sound, a low patience, and the air tasted of iron and wet bark and something old. Henry felt safe inside his numbers. Mary felt the opposite safety, the kind that comes when a choice refuses to leave you alone. She hovered in the brush where the bank curved and held the twine gently so it did not pull. She did not plan to shout or run at him. She planned to learn the rhythm of his steps and to cut the work in its middle where it hid its face. The sky faded from hot brass to dull iron, and bats stitched the gap between river and trees. Henry left his door with the wrapped shape under his arm and the careful balance of a man who will not allow a stumble to rewrite a story. Eli waited where Martha had sent him to meet the water commissioner and learn a useful trick. Henry praised the boy's steady posture and said a lesson in measure could make a child the pride of strong men. And the boy's chest lifted at the promise. Mary felt the twine move against her skin and knew the lesson was already a weapon, the kind that asks the victim to carry part of its weight. She moved when Henry moved, counting silently with him, and saw the marked footprint catch the moonlight like a pale order on the ground. She understood the plan. The yoke would look like a tray, the tins like toys, the river like help. No one in that moment would call it killing except the river, which had learned the word years ago and refused to teach it to the town. At the water's lip, Henry set the yoke across his knees and explained balance in the same calm voice he used for ration notices, and Eli nodded and reached, because children reach before they question. Mary closed her hand around the twine and took one breath longer than comfort, then another, and fixed the next breath for when the tins touched the surface and sank together. The equinox wind slid down the valley and touched the reeds, and the smell of iron thickened until it felt like a hand on the mouth. Night gathered its weight. The river waited for the proof Henry loved most, and Mary waited to break it in two and carry the broken piece back to the town that had forgotten how to see. Henry Alderman moved with a calm that looked like kindness while the equinox wind slid through the reeds. Eli Pike held the small yoke with both hands, tins dull as pewter, shoulders straight because praise sat near. Mary waited in the brush with twine around her wrist, her breath counted, her fear folded into a plan. Henry spoke in his even tone about balance and trust, and the boy nodded because children hear respect louder than warning. He set the yoke across Eli's forearms, tapped the center cup, and guided him forward until the tins kissed the surface and began to drink. The wood steadied, then sank with a slow grace that looked harmless if you did not know its purpose. Mary felt the twine stir on her skin. She rose and pulled once, hard. The boy jolted, ripples ran. Henry did not startle. He turned the way a man turns toward a sound he had expected and pressed 2 fingers to the back of the yoke so both tins took another mouthful together. Mary reached the bank and told the boy to step back, but her words broke on the water. The yoke drew him in with the soft lie that help often wears. Henry added a pebble to the near tin, an act that looked like keeping the tool steady. The wood touched the boy's chest. Mary waded into her knees. Cold seized her bones. She gripped the wood and pushed up. The tins fought back. Henry freed his hand as if yielding space. In that space, the water climbed, the weight settled, and the pull grew sure. Eli's eyes flicked toward Mary, asking without words. She lifted harder and felt the far tin take a gulp that undid her strength. The yoke dropped. The tins drank together. The river pulled all at once. Mary slipped, went under to the waist, and rose coughing iron. Henry stepped back with clerkly neatness, touched Eli's hair, and murmured that the river keeps good weight. The boy's mouth opened and closed without sound. The center cup lost its air and sank like a coin. Mary grabbed the wire that threaded the tin. It cut her palm and sang with tightness. She rapped it twice and hauled it. The wire held. The river had built a second hand around it. The twine sawed her wrist. Memory of Martha's laugh stung her. Eli's chin slid under. His face turned to the side as if still trusting the lesson. The water accepted that trust and wore it calm. A small wave tapped the bank. Henry closed his eyes and counted ounces, and when the number came, he let his hands fall like a man finishing a task. The surface is sealed. Bubbles rose, small and neat. Moonlight stamped a pale coin where the tins had gone down. Mary stood shaking, hair on her cheeks, hands cut, wrist string hanging in 2 dark tails. She stared until the world thinned. Then the color came not from flesh but from the current itself, as if a secret stain had waited for a cue. Red uncoiled from the reeds, heavy and old, the shade of rust that learned patience. It touched her knees and kept moving, licking roots and stones, turning shallows into a remembering mirror. The smell rose at once, sweet metal and wet iron. Upstream a dog howled and stopped. Downstream the mill wheel dragged and stuttered like a throat-clearing grief. Henry checked his hands for stains and whispered to the night that balance was kept and the river would settle. Mary crawled from the water when her legs failed, pressed her forehead to the ground, and did not cry because her tears were busy counting. When she stood, the yoke was gone. Only 2 pale heel moons dented the mud where Henry had set his stance. She saw the page under her floorboard in her mind, and the word beside Eli's name. A small word that had grown teeth. She thought of elders talking about keeping calm in faces, and of Martha folding linen in a yard that would be empty by morning. Hatred rose like heat, then cooled into something harder. Under it a clear purpose began to live. She wrapped the broken twine in her palm and walked toward town, leaving a thin dark line on the path like a mark on a ledger. Behind her, the red kept spreading, quiet as breath, steady as an answer that does not change when asked twice. She passed the mill lane and saw lamps waver as people woke to iron in the air. A door opened and shut without greeting. A woman drew a bucket, stared at the stain, then poured it back to undo the hour. Mary kept walking. Behind her, Henry's steps faded toward the sluice house, tread of a man who believed he spared the town harm. Clouds slid over the moon, the river turned black, then red, as if it could not decide which face to keep. Mary did not look back. She chose what the morning would find. The red did not arrive like a scream, it arrived like a decision. At first light, the river carried a rusty sheen that brushed the reeds and then thickened, turning the shallows into slow mirrors the color of old nails. By breakfast, it had slid over the lower steps, crept into cellars, and laid a thin skin across the mill road, so quiet that people noticed the smell before they saw the stain. It tasted like coins on the tongue. Milk in cups turned gray at the rim. Chickens pecked and jumped back with small, shocked cries. Cows leaned away from troughs, ropes going tight, eyes rolling white. Dogs placed their paws, sniffed twice, and chose thirst. The mill wheel dragged and groaned like a throat scraping for sound, and flour clumped to paste along the trough. Men waded to the sluice and came back with their boots ringing and their mouths shut. The elders stood in a knot and tried to wear calm like a coat, but calm looked thin in the red light. No one had a word for it that did not wound, so they used none. They just moved slower and kept their thoughts under their tongues. Mary Harrow walked through it with her skirt pinned high, her palms bandaged where wire had bitten, the ledger page flat against her ribs. She stopped at Martha Pike's door and held her while the woman shook without sound, then set a neighbor girl by the hearth because the day would not pause for one house. She passed the bridge and the blacksmith's low shed and went to the church, where the bell pulled a dull note through the iron smell. Faces turned with the look of people waiting for someone else to start the next sentence. The name Henry sat among them like a tool everyone needed and no one trusted. When he came up the path, cuffs pale and mouth a steady line, relief and anger rose together like two hands reaching for the same handle. He said the surge would pass when order returned, that the river only asked for steadiness, that panic was a waste. Hands found his sleeves, not rough at first, only sure. He said balance and cycle and keeping, and each word, once comforting, now rang like the lid of an empty pot. A woman asked where her husband had gone last week. He did not answer. A boy's uncle asked why the wheel would not turn. He did not answer. The elder stepped closer, making a wall that looked protective and weak at the same time. The path flooded in a single push. The edge of the people broke and then reset. Henry did not step back. He moved along the stones with the clerkly neatness that had hidden so much harm and reached for the chain that held the gate. A coil of rope slid under his boot, his weight shifted. He caught the post, jaw tight, water pressing at his knees. He turned the wheel 3 notches, then another, and the iron sang. The spray touched his mouth and tasted of bitter metal. For a breath the world held still, as if waiting to learn which way the measure would tip. Then the chain snapped free with a crack that sounded like bone. The gate lurched and the river took him. He went over cleanly, not flailing, as if the fall belonged to the work. A few hands reached and then pulled back when the current heaved. Henry slipped under the red skin and was gone. No hat, no scrap of cloth, nothing to float and make a false hope. The bend accepted the secret and kept moving. The square did not shout. It just grew quiet in a new way. Someone said he would rise downstream. Someone else said the river spits back what it does not want. Mary did not believe either sentence. She ran to the water office with 3 boys at her heels and found the door not locked but pinned shut by nails driven straight through thick sheaves of paper. The nail heads sat in a perfect line, as if a ruler had been held to them. Each sheet bore the careful hand the town knew from ration notices, but the words were not rations. Names marched in columns. Small reasons sat beside them like teeth. Burden figures stood in a last neat row. Mary tore 3 pages free and the nails squealed. Inside, the desk drawer gaped and the false bottom had tilted. The leather ledger itself was gone. On the wall, 1 page was pinned with a single nail set dead center. It said the river will choose now in letters that did not shake. She carried the loose sheets into the square and held them high. Men who loved order saw their neighbors weighed like sacks of grain. Women who trusted quiet saw thin red lines beside familiar names. The elders stood very still and said they had never seen those pages before, but their eyes looked at the ground when they said it. By noon, the river settled into a broad sheet that hummed low as if the earth were breathing through a wound. The wheel turned only enough to make it ache. Fields near the bank wore a shallow glaze. Wells tasted wrong. People moved like they were inside a church even when they were not. Henry did not return. Nobody drifted to the bend. His house door stood open on a room squared and quiet, a life arranged to convince. The neat beds behind it looked like small ledgers scratched into dirt. The flood did not roar. It pressed. It made the town speak softly. It made the elders old. It made even the strong men look small. At dusk, the red thinned at the edges but did not leave. Lamps threw sick halos on the wet road. Mary climbed the church steps with the papers and drew 1 breath for courage and 1 for the dead. Then she began to read line by line in a voice that carried because grief can be clear. People listened. No one looked away. The names were a history laid bare, and the reasons were small words with weight. Waste, trespass, descent, repeat. After each word, a neat figure for burden, as if a life could be set on a scale and made to sit still. When the last line was spoken, the square seemed larger, as if the walls of silence had been moved back by force. The river kept its low hum. The red in the reeds held fast like old paint. Night came without stars. Mary gathered the pages and felt their weight like a new kind of law. Henry was gone, claimed by the rule he had served. The ledger was missing, but the proof was nailed where any eye could see. Tomorrow the names would be counted again, and the reasons would be said aloud without code. Tonight the town stood in the press of the red and learned how heavy balance can be when it is made of flesh. Morning made the papers look colder, and the town lined the church hall as if weather were written there. Mary spread the nailed sheets flat and kept her hands steady so no one could mistake her for an enemy of order. Names that were once neighbors became a ledger with years beside them, and small marks showed the season. The marks clumped at spring and fall until a pattern felt like a bruise under the skin. The hush that followed was not relief. It was the hard hush that settles when fear finally admits its shape. They traced the code aloud so no one could pretend it was too hard. N for name, C for cycle, R for a reason, B for burden, waste, trespass, descent, repeat. The words were tiny but had the weight of doors shutting and planks turning slick under a foot at night. Mary found Thomas Brand and Ruth Layton, then her husband's neat line with its clean burden figure and the thin red stroke crossing it like a tidy cut. A mill hand touched a date and said the wheel dragged that week until flour clumped. A mother put her finger on a number and swayed, and someone sat her down before she fell. A carpenter set a fresh plank and copied the names large so old eyes could follow. Families called out the missing and the plank lengthened with chalk marks. From the back, a woman spoke the name of a girl who had gone to clear reeds and never returned. And Mary found the girl's row with a burden number that made the floor tilt. By noon, the list had grown into a wall of days. A boy climbed on a bench to ring the bell once for each name, and each strike moved through the chest like a small stone. The elders said little. They stood near the door like men guarding a fire and watched shame move through the hall like slow weather. A farmer added 2 names from memory. Men who had slipped before Henry began to write this code. And for a breath the room held the idea that the river had always taken and Henry had only learned its rule. That thought made some feel safe and others sick. Mary opened a small oiled folder and found a different page, thicker than the rest, almost empty, no names, no dates. Only one sentence in the same careful hand, centered like a lesson on a slate. The river will choose now. She read it twice and then a third time. The words did not tremble. She saw what Henry had seen when he wrote them. He believed he was a steward, not a king. He believed his rights kept the water level, and that if his hand were removed, the river would correct the town by itself. It was not a confession. It was a handover, cold and neat. Voices rose against the wood rafters. Burn the pages, lock them in the vestry, send them to the county and let strangers weigh them. Mary said paper must be seen or it grows a second life in the dark. She copied the lists again, this time on a school slate with chalk that squeaked, the sound thin and stubborn. The elders said the stain was iron from the hills and would pass. Mary pointed to the pans dragged from the reeds, to the wire bites still raw on her palms, to the little yoke that had gone under with a child's hand set true. The hall believed her because belief had run out of places to hide. Men brought more sheets from the water office, corners still nailed where Henry had pinned them in a final row. People sorted them by year and a slow picture formed. Every equinox was a gate. Some years the gate took 1 life, some years 3, some years none, but only after a winter of tight rations. The newer pages showed haste, red strokes added mid-cycle, figures changed, the calm hand forced to move sooner than before. The last page ended with that single sentence and a blank space where names should live. Toward evening, a dry wind slid through the open windows and laid a faint grain smell under the iron, and for a breath the room imagined summer. Then the red hum returned and the old scent settled back across the tongue. A woman asked what would keep them safe now that Henry was gone. The churchman said discipline and prayer. The miller said less use and harder work. The elders said we will keep. Mary did not trust any of those words alone. She made a new column marked living, another marked dead, and a third named missing, and tied a strip of cloth to each so people could add what they knew. By dusk, the cloth for missing was the longest, and that length made the air thin. They carried the names outside and nailed them to the water office door in a clear order. Families touched the paper with 2 fingers as if greeting the dead. The boy rang, the bell again, slower now. The river lay wide and dull and red at the edges like a wound that had learned patience. Birds that had shouted all afternoon fell quiet at once. In the silence, someone said another turning would not come until fall. Someone else said the sky felt wrong. Mary heard both and folded a copy of the list into her shawl. Night gathered with no stars. Lamps made thin halos on the wet road. She locked the rest of the pages in the vestry where a metal box had once held wedding cups and stood on the step to watch the water hold its breath again, only now without Henry's shadow inside it. The sentence on the empty page sat in her mind like a weight that did not need a scale. The river will choose now. Near midnight, the wheel twitched as if waking from a hard sleep. The hum in the bank grew deeper. A thin band of rust moved against the reeds as if drawn by a hidden hand. Mary closed her eyes and counted not ounces, not pails, but days. The number she reached should have promised a quiet month. Instead, it tasted wrong. The town had measured all it could measure. What came next would not ask permission, and the line between steward and servant slipped under the dark where the next choice was already taking shape. The river kept its red skin after Henry was gone, and the town learned how heavy a day can be when water will not forgive. On the third night, a woman from the lower orchard did not return, and at dawn she lay in the reeds with 2 stones at her ankles, knots neat, balance exact. Men called it a copy of Henry's work, but Mary saw the angle and felt a colder truth, that the pattern had learned to move by itself. By noon, a mill boy was found with his wrists caught in a wire cradle, palms open as if offering the river a small prayer. Doors latched, mothers hid buckets. The bell rang once, and then fell quiet because the sound felt like surrender. He had kept the surface smooth, making death look like chance. Now the surface seemed to want witnesses, as if the river had grown proud of its arithmetic. Mary felt the knots and knew Henry had tied like this once, yet these reeds had been gathered from a bar he never used. Copycat or current, she thought, it did not matter. The town had taught the lesson, and the lesson was finishing the term without its master. She called the elders and said the pact was dead. They answered with weary faces and talk of discipline and prayer, and she said those words were good but weak when kept alone. She set guards at the bends, lanterns on posts, lines across paths, watchers in pairs so no one stood alone. They agreed because agreement cost nothing, and boys were posted with lamps whose light shook whenever wind crossed the red skin. Night came heavy, and the first shout rose from the far bend where 2 watchers held a bell and a coil of rope. When others arrived, the rope lay straight, looped to a peg, and a girl of 12 swayed from it with 2 iron pans at her elbows, arms drawn, down until joints locked. The pans were not Henry's. They had been hammered from kitchen lids, proof that a template now lived in the town's hands. Mary lifted the girl, cut the rope, and held her while the bell shook itself quiet. Footprints left the scene in 2 directions, both clear, both the same size, and no one could tell if that meant 2 people or one who had learned to walk like a mirror. The girl lived, choking and blinking iron water, and hope struck hard and then passed through the crowd like a nail through soft wood. Toward dawn, the river eased for a breath, and the watchers dared to think the worst had drifted past them. When the sun came, The red thinned at the edges but did not leave, and 3 more names were added to the plank by noon. A county rider arrived before sunset with a wet coat and a badge like a coin and asked where the commissioner's body had gone, and the elders gave him hollow answers. He walked the bank and said accident, then looked at the pans and said murder, then looked at the lists and said both because the paper forced too many choices at once. Mary placed the copies in his hands and saw anger rise like heat in metal, the kind that hardens into duty. He did not ride. By morning he lay at the shallow below the bridge with a stone in each boot and his hat pinned to a root by a single nail set dead center. Lamps guttered along the bank as if a breath had moved through them from under the water, and the elders stared until thinking hurt. Do not stand alone by the bank. Do not carry pans. Do not tie knots with reed or wire. Do not trust a calm hand near water. Mary added a rule she did not say aloud. Do not believe the river gives back what you put in. It keeps the lesson. On the 7th night the humming deepened until the millstones trembled and the surface smoothed so flat the stars should have shone if the sky had offered them. The watchers saw only their thin faces bending in the dark and a low glow like banked coals moving under the skin. A shape surfaced near the sluice and rolled once. Some swore it was Henry. Some swore it was a log. Mary thought the worst truth was that it was the work itself wearing a face. At dawn, the red slid toward the valley mouth and left a tacky line on stones and a silence that tasted medicinal. People drank from barrels and cried without sound. The town had lived through the last turning of that season, but it had not won. Wagons creaked toward the hills with chairs and feather ticks lashed down, and empty houses leaned into the river wind like elders before a cold fire. Mary folded the lists and wrote in a clean hand across the cover. Names kept against forgetting. She locked them in the vestry box and gave the key to the youngest child who had rung the bell. Because the oldest had built the pact and could not be trusted with memory. Then she stood on the bridge and watched the water run clear and felt no relief. Only the knowledge that clarity can be the cruelest mask a river wears when it already knows your weight. She turned toward the road to the county seat where law might learn to read red ink, and behind her, the mill wheel turned slowly now, dragging past flour and days, grinding what remained into a powder for a different bread. The river ran clear the summer after the last turning, but Goldbar never looked at it the same. Fences leaned from the bank as if wood could remember, and children learned to count by tapping posts and skipping the ones closest to the water. Mary Harrow carried a tin box to the county seat and set the lists before men who wore badges and read slowly. She did not soften what the pages said. The law called the papers evidence and the town called them shame. And for once those words matched. Investigators walked the bends, measured gates, and asked why a single clerk had held the key to a river. They did not find Henry Alderman's body, but they found his weight and habits and rules, pressed like fingerprints in drying wax. Orders came first for Goldbar and then for nearby towns. No single hand would control a river that feeds a people. Ledgers must be copied, meetings held with doors open and minutes read aloud. By 1890, the sentence was printed plain in county books, and committees replaced the old chair with many seats. On the bank a memorial rose, a low wall of river stone laced with 5 iron nails set in a straight line to mark the year the names were read. School children came each spring with slates and were told to measure without cruelty, to count the living and the dead with the same calm hand. Mary served on the new waterboard with her back straight and her voice steady. Rations were set by vote in rooms where windows stayed open. Each equinox she stood at the wall and read the list in a clear voice that moved like a slow bell. And no one told the widows to lower their grief. The elders who had built the pact kept their hats in their hands and watched without speeches. The mill wheel gained a guard and a posted rule that said, "Waste is a wound you can choose." Farmers set cisterns on high ground. Pipes were laid in pairs so one break would not drown a house. Doctors kept small vials labeled iron and taught mothers what the taste in water meant. The archive kept Henry's ledgers under glass, open to a page with neat red strokes that once felt like answers. People stood over the case and learned how tidy harm can look. There were months when the river ran sweet and the town almost forgot. And then a fog slid down from the hills and the smell of rust sat in the morning and memory tightened like a belt. Inspectors arrived at each equinox to weigh gates and compare records, and lying cost more than a sack of flour in a wet year. Mary took praise like a debt paid late and set it aside. At dusk she tapped each nail in the wall with a small hammer to keep them true, because soft weather and soft minds pull iron loose. She kept the vestry key until her hands shook, then pressed it into the palm of the boy who had rung the bell, now a quiet man who taught children to read. He promised to open the box each spring, to name the taken, to ask the same hard question the town still owed itself. Some families left and never wrote. Others stayed and planted willows whose roots drank far from the main flow. There were small mercies. The wheels stuttered less, coughs eased in winter, lamps burned without warping their light. But the river's lesson lived on. It was in how people poured a cup, in how long they let a pump run, in the silence that fell when someone said Henry's name. Visitors looked at the smooth water and called it peaceful, and the old ones answered that peace is only the face, not the heart. When Mary's hair went white, she asked to be buried on the hill where she could see the bend and the line of nails catching river light. On the day she was carried up, the water ran clear. People said the river was kind, and she would have said it was only honest. After the service, the board signed a rule on one page and pinned it to the office door. Never hide the cost of order. The paper shook once in the wind and then went still. Years later, strangers stopped to read the plaque and trace the iron, some leaving a chalk name not their own. As if sorrow could be passed like a pail from hand to hand. Gold Bar did not return to what it was before. It learned instead to carry its weight where everyone could see, and to fear the quiet more than the storm. The wall and the water taught patience, memory, and restraint together. Henry Alderman did not leave a curse behind. He left a method. Years later, the water runs plain and the wall of stone holds its 5 nails, and children ask why iron sits in rock. The answer lives in the space between a rule and the hand that enforces it. Evil does not always shout or break. It measures, it copies, it waits for good people to choose silence because silence feels like safety. It borrows the voice of order and the look of care, and it moves best when rooms are neat and minutes are short. Henry's ledgers lie under glass now, red strokes thin as veins. The script so steady a stranger might trust it. On the bank, the memorial stones shine after rain. Names are rubbed bright by hands that refuse forgetting. Each spring, the list is read, and no one asks for soft words. Mary Harrow is gone to the hill, yet her work remains like a lamp kept low but lit. The bell ringer she chose unlocks the vestry box and tells the children that order can turn into a knife if no one watches the hand that holds it. They look at the clear water and try to picture red, and their faces say it is hard. That difficulty is the danger. Evil prefers clean rooms and steady voices. It likes checklists and keys, timetables and gates. It does not mind prayer if prayer means quiet and not change. It moves in ledgers and ration notes and small corrections that add up to something a town cannot bear to say aloud. Henry believed he was kind. In his mind, mercy meant pruning before rot spread, and numbers felt like proof that he was doing right. He did not rage or boast. He worked like a clerk, washed his hands, and wrote a neat line. That is the shape most harm takes in safe places. It is done by caretakers who say balance when they mean control, by committees that vote to keep the wheel turning while the cost goes elsewhere, by elders who call their fear prudence. The river's lesson is simple and hard. If no one names the weight will find a home of its own. After the laws changed, the gates were measured by many hands and minutes were read aloud with windows open, and that helped. But rules cannot love you back. They are tools, and tools keep the character of the hand that grips them. The old danger returns whenever a form is signed without thought, whenever tidy numbers are praised more than honest eyes, whenever a quiet person is given a narrow key and no one asks what door it opens. So people in Gold Bar still stop at the bridge after storms and watch the color at the reeds. Most days they see only their own faces. On some mornings a faint brown band rides the grass and everyone feels their chest tighten, not because the water is red, but because memory is. They do not run. They test the gates, they count together, they speak aloud the steps Henry worked alone. They know now that silence is a river of its own. Mary once wrote on a margin that secrets rot when hidden and grow roots when named. The line outlived her and is painted on the school wall each fall. Naming is not enough, but it is a start. The deeper work is harder. It is asking why a rule exists, who it serves, and who pays. It is remembering that balance is not a number, it is a promise to see the whole cost. It is daring to break a beautiful pattern when that pattern turns a person into a weight. The river moves like a lesson that never ends. It remembers the ledgers and the pans and the nights when a calm voice turned a child into a measure. It also remembers the day a town looked at itself in daylight and chose to keep looking. Both memories live here under the bridge and on the hill and in the rooms where records are read aloud. The face of evil is often tidy, helpful, and patient. It keeps good notes. It smiles as it tightens a rule that should have been questioned. It asks for trust while it counts in secret. It waits for the day a town says that keeping the peace matters more than keeping the truth. Gold Bar learned that peace without truth is only a quiet room with the door locked from the outside. The nails in the wall are there to keep the door from closing again. If this river teaches anything, it is that safety is a work all hands must share and a silence no one should keep. Now the choice passes to anyone who hears this story and feels the small weight of its words. Look at your own river, whatever shape it takes. Ask whose ledgers go unread, whose balance is never checked in daylight, whose calm voice hides a narrow key. Ask what you are willing to name before the water turns. Remember this and speak. What do you think? Could this happen again?